My name is Olwyn Meliora. I'm in my late 30s. I've spent most of my adult life in structured rooms, conference rooms, briefing rooms, boardrooms where voices compete for space and authority often announces itself before competence does. On paper, I'm unremarkable. Mid-level leadership, operational oversight, the kind of title that sounds important enough to carry weight, but not important enough to intimidate anyone. I speak softly. I rarely interrupt. I don't perform confidence, I practice precision. And because of that, people tend to miscalculate me. They assume I'm agreeable, adaptable, grateful to be included. They interpret my pauses as hesitation, my silence as uncertainty. What they don't understand is that I pause to observe. I stay quiet to gather. I rarely react because reaction reveals position. This story isn't about revenge, it isn't about humiliation, and it certainly isn't about winning. It's about documentation. It's about what happens when intimidation meets evidence. The title of this story is My Manager Threatened to Blacklist Me, I Forwarded the Threat to Legal. And the lesson underneath it is simple. Intimidation doesn't work when it's documented. But that clarity didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. It came slowly in small dismissals, subtle power plays, and conversations framed as career advice. It came in the way someone smiled while positioning themselves as your gatekeeper. It came on the assumption that you wouldn't challenge the narrative being built around you. For a long time, I was seen as reliable, efficient, quiet, useful, not threatening, not ambitious, not strategic, and that perception was the most powerful leverage I ever had. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how subtle disrespect becomes normalized, how silence can transform from a coping mechanism into a strategy, and how a single documented sentence can dismantle an entire posture of authority. There were no raised voices, no dramatic resignations, no public exposure, just calm decisions and consequences that unfolded exactly as they needed to. This is a story about psychological reversal, but not through confrontation, through clarity. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been underestimated so thoroughly that people stopped guarding themselves around you? To them, I was dependable. That was the word used most often in performance reviews. Dependable, steady, a safe pair of hands. It sounds like praise, and in some contexts, it is. But inside corporate architecture, safe can quietly translate to non-threatening. At our firm in London, hierarchy wasn't loud, it was implied. Titles mattered, but proximity to power mattered more. My manager, I'll call him Daniel, had mastered that ecosystem. He was articulate, charismatic in controlled doses, and very careful about who witnessed which version of him. To Daniel, I was efficient infrastructure. I handled escalations without noise. I absorbed cross-team friction. I remembered compliance details others conveniently forgot. If something needed fixing quietly, it landed on my desk. If something needed to be presented loudly, it landed on his. In meetings, I rarely competed for airtime. I spoke when necessary. I didn't dramatize problems, I framed them. That restraint was interpreted as passivity. Colleagues often described me as calm under pressure, but the subtext was always the same. Olwyn won't push back. I was the person you could assign extra work to because I wouldn't protest publicly. The person you could interrupt mid-sentence because I would simply wait and resume later. The person who would stay late to correct errors that weren't mine and never mention whose they were. I wasn't invisible. I was visible in a controlled way. Useful visibility, functional visibility, the kind that supports a structure but doesn't claim space within it. Daniel relied on that. He often introduced me to clients as the operational backbone of the team. It sounded complimentary, but it subtly positioned me as structural support rather than a strategic mind. Backbone, not brain. When restructuring conversations surfaced at the leadership level, I was told, "You're invaluable where you are." That sentence is more limiting than it appears. Invaluable people are rarely promoted. They are preserved. The truth is, I allowed that perception to exist because early in my career, I had learned a painful lesson: reacting emotionally to dismissal makes you look unstable. Not wrong. Years ago, in my first management role, I challenged a director publicly about inaccurate reporting. I was correct. I also became labeled difficult. Accuracy didn't protect me. Politics overruled it. So I adapted. I stopped correcting in rooms. I started documenting privately. I stopped arguing tone. I started preserving transcripts. I stopped trying to be understood. I focused on being prepared. By the time I joined this firm, my quiet had evolved from self-protection into a method. But here's what they didn't realize: silence accumulates data. Every meeting recap I sent, every policy reference I attached, every follow-up email summarizes as discussed. They saw administrative thoroughness. I was building timeline architecture. Still, to them, I was the composed operations manager who wouldn't disrupt equilibrium, the reliable executor, the steady background presence. Daniel once joked in a meeting, "Olwyn's too professional to ever make waves." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled too, because what they interpreted as temperament was actually patience. And patience, when paired with records, becomes leverage. The first cut didn't feel like a wound. It felt like an adjustment. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in early March, during a budget alignment meeting. Nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just numbers on a screen and the quiet choreography of corporate positioning. I had prepared a revised operational forecast, conservative, compliant, defensible. Daniel had reviewed it the night before. He'd replied with a single sentence, "Looks fine, we'll align tomorrow." In the meeting, he opened the deck. He skipped 3 slides. When he reached the cost-risk projection, the section I had modelled carefully to reflect regulatory exposure, he paused. "I think we're being overly cautious here," he said lightly. "We don't want to slow growth by overestimating compliance drag." He clicked on an older version, not the one I'd sent, an earlier draft, before the risk adjustments. The room nodded. Growth is a comfortable word, risk is not. I didn't interrupt immediately. I waited for the natural opening that never came. He reframed the numbers as strategically ambitious. He repositioned caution as hesitation, and because he spoke fluidly and confidently. The narrative shifted before anyone questioned it. When he finally turned to me, it wasn't to invite clarification, it was to request validation. "Olwyn, we're comfortable with this direction." "Yes, comfortable." That word again. There's a particular pressure in moments like that when correction requires friction, when speaking would reposition yourself as resistant rather than precise. So I answered carefully, "I'll circulate the updated risk model after the meeting so everyone has visibility." It wasn't an agreement, but it wasn't a confrontation. The meeting moved on. Afterward, 2 colleagues stopped by my desk. "Daniel's right. We can't always lead with caution," one said casually. "You're great at details, but sometimes we just need momentum." "Great with details," the phrase lingered. That evening, I reviewed the email thread. I reread his "looks fine. We'll align tomorrow." I compared timestamps on file versions. I saved the draft history. Not out of anger, out of recognition. It wasn't about the numbers. It was about repositioning. Subtle repositioning, shifting me from strategic contributor to cautious administrator. From co-owner of decision-making to risk monitor. That's how reputations change, not through accusations, through framing. I told myself it wasn't intentional. Leaders adjust messaging in meetings all the time. Maybe he thought the older slide presented better. Maybe he forgot. Rationalization is an efficient coping mechanism. But I noticed something else in the weeks that followed. When presenting to executives, Daniel began summarizing my analyses rather than inviting me to explain them. When cross-functional discussions turned tense, he'd say, "Olwyn will manage the operational cleanup," as though I were a resolution mechanism rather than a strategist. Small shifts, small language changes. Each one is deniable. Each one is cumulative. The first cut rarely bleeds immediately. It just teaches you how someone sees you and how they plan to position you when it benefits them. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't escalate. I started paying closer attention. Because the moment someone edits your narrative in public, you have 2 options. Correct them in real time or record the pattern. I chose the second. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They accumulate. After that March meeting, nothing exploded. There were no dramatic confrontations. In fact, if someone had asked me at the time whether I felt disrespected, I would have hesitated, because each instance, isolated, was reasonable. Daniel began forwarding client emails to me with short instructions. "Handle, sort this, Make it smooth. No context, no shared ownership, just delegation without visibility of the strategic framing that preceded it. When executive updates were required, he'd summarize operational changes in broad strokes, then say, Olwyn's team will take care of implementation. It was efficient, it was clean, it also quietly stripped authorship from the underlying strategy work I'd contributed. In meetings, interruptions became slightly more frequent. Not aggressive, just timed well enough to redirect attention. If I began outlining risk implications, he'd pivot toward opportunity. If I suggested a phased rollout, he'd emphasize urgency. He never contradicted me directly. He reframed me. That distinction matters. Contradiction invites debate. Reframing creates perception. And perception spreads faster than facts. Colleagues began looping him into emails that once came directly to me. Questions about feasibility were now phrased as requests for his final view. When he echoed my earlier points, they were received as decisive leadership rather than cautious analysis. I noticed, I catalogued, I stayed outwardly steady. There's a psychological phenomenon where repeated minor violations become normalized simply because they don't seem severe enough to protest. You convince yourself it's politics, or personality, or timing. You tell yourself not to be sensitive. I told myself that. He's under pressure. It's just presentation style. This is how influence works at this level. And there was truth in those statements. But there was another truth beneath them. My role was being narrowed. Not officially, not in the title, but in perception. The dependable one, the executor, the compliance anchor. One afternoon, during a leadership sync, a new director asked, "Who owns strategic forecasting on this account?" Daniel responded without hesitation, "I do. Olwyn supports the operational modeling." Supports. The word was technically accurate. It was also incomplete. I felt the familiar instinct to clarify that I had built the forecasting architecture, that I'd introduced the compliance overlay that protected margin projections. But I didn't. Because I'd learned something over the years, correcting someone in a room where they hold social capital often costs more than it yields. Instead, I added a sentence. Yes, and I'll circulate the updated forecasting framework so everyone has transparency on the assumptions. Again, not a challenge, just documentation. After the meeting, Daniel stopped by my office. "You don't need to overcomplicate things in those settings," he said mildly. "Executives prefer clarity." I nodded. Clarity? Another word that can be weaponized gently. What I began to understand during that period wasn't that Daniel disliked me. It was subtler than that. He was consolidating narrative authority, and I had been allowing it because I valued stability over visibility. Disrespect, when subtle, doesn't feel like hostility. It feels like erosion, a slow narrowing of space, a gradual shift from collaborator to subordinate in ways that are difficult to articulate without sounding defensive. So I stopped trying to articulate it. I shifted my energy elsewhere. If perception were being shaped in rooms, then evidence would be shaped in records. I created folders, saved versions, archived threads, not because I anticipated conflict, but because normalization is dangerous when untracked. And something in me, quiet, steady, analytical, began to sense that this pattern wasn't random. It was directional. There's a moment in every professional dynamic when you realize you've been cast. Not promoted, not demoted, cast. I began to see it clearly during quarterly planning. The firm was restructuring portfolios, and leadership discussed expanding into new regulatory territories, complex, high-margin markets that required precision. I had experience there, direct experience, prior compliance certifications, relationships with legal advisors from my previous firm. On paper, I was positioned well to lead that expansion. In conversation, I was positioned differently. "Olwyn will ensure our internal processes are ready," Daniel said during a planning call. "She's excellent at keeping us aligned." Aligned? I was being placed in the role of stabilizer, not strategist. Later that week, I reviewed the draft restructuring proposal. Daniel had included a section outlining strategic expansion oversight. His name was attached as lead. Mine appeared under operational assurance. The phrasing was careful, respectful, technically accurate, but the architecture of responsibility told a different story. I wasn't being excluded, I was being contained. Reliable, useful, invisible in ambition. That's when I understood the role assigned to me, the competent guardian of infrastructure. The steady executor who ensures ideas don't fail but doesn't originate the ideas publicly. It's a comfortable role for leadership to maintain around them. It ensures support without competition. I don't believe Daniel woke up one morning plotting to sideline me. I think he observed the way I worked quietly, thoroughly, and concluded I wouldn't contest the boundaries he drew. And for a long time, he was correct. There's safety in being underestimated, expectations are low, pressure is diffused. You're rarely scrutinized for dominance because no one perceives it. But there's also a limitation. One afternoon, while reviewing performance calibration notes, I came across a sentence in my internal evaluation summary. Alwyn excels in supportive leadership roles and provides essential structural continuity. Supportive! The word wasn't insulting, it was defining. That night, I opened my leather notebook, the one I carry everywhere, and wrote a single question. Is this who I am, or is this who they find convenient? The answer wasn't immediate. Because I value structure, I value systems, I value steadiness. There was truth in their description of me, but there was also an omission. No mention of the strategic modeling frameworks I'd designed, no reference to negotiation outcomes I'd influenced, no acknowledgement of risk mitigations that had saved the firm significant financial exposure. I was being credited for maintenance, not architecture. That's when something subtle shifted internally. Not anger, recognition. Roles become permanent when you accept them without examination. And I had accepted this one because it felt safe. Safe from political battles, safe from scrutiny, safe from visibility. But safety and growth rarely coexist indefinitely. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't request a title change. I didn't schedule a dramatic career discussion. Instead, I began observing the structure more closely. Who signs what? Who approves what? Whose words become record? Whose words become a footnote? When you understand architecture, you understand leverage. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the role they assigned me was limiting or positioning. Because sometimes, being the person who maintains the structure means you're the only one who truly understands where it's fragile. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday evening, alone in the office, long after most of the lights had dimmed. I was reviewing contract amendments for a new client, a fast-moving acquisition that Daniel was eager to secure. The deal was aggressive, the timeline compressed. There were compliance clauses that required careful phrasing to avoid exposure across jurisdictions. I flagged 3 areas that needed revision and sent him a concise summary. His response came quickly. Overthinking this will slow us down. We're not in the business of hypothetical risk. Hypothetical? I read the word twice. Because the risk wasn't hypothetical. It was documented in regulatory guidance I had attached to my original email. I began drafting a reply, outlining the statutory language and precedent cases. Halfway through, I stopped. Not because I doubted myself, because I recognized the pattern. Every time I provided structural resistance to protect the firm, it was reframed as excessive caution. Every time I deferred publicly, it reinforced the perception that I agreed privately. I closed the email draft. Instead, I opened the firm's policy database. I reviewed the internal compliance escalation protocol, the one rarely used because it bypassed managerial discretion and routed concerns directly to legal and risk governance when regulatory exposure crossed defined thresholds. Most employees never referenced it. Most managers assumed it was theoretical. It wasn't. I read it slowly, line by line. There it was. If a team member identifies potential regulatory or contractual risk that has been dismissed without documented review, escalation through formal channels is not only permitted but required. Required? The language was clear. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For years, I had been operating within the visible structure meetings, summaries, strategic language, but there was another structure running parallel to it: policy, documentation, formal accountability. I realized something in that quiet office. Daniel's authority functioned through narrative control, through confidence, through room dynamics. But institutional authority functions through record, and the record does not respond to charisma. I reopened my email draft. This time, I removed emotional tone entirely. I cited policy clause numbers, I attached regulatory excerpts, I referenced timestamps of prior risk discussions, and at the end, I added one sentence. For transparency, I'll be forwarding this to legal for formal review under escalation protocol. I stared at that line for a long moment. It wasn't defiance. It was compliance, but compliance at a structural level rather than a social one. I hit send. Then, I forwarded the thread to legal and risk governance with a neutral cover note outlining potential exposure and prior internal dismissal. No accusation, no commentary, just documentation. I shut down my computer and left the office. On the train home, I didn't replay the decision with anxiety. I didn't rehearse defensive arguments. I simply observed my own calm. Something had shifted permanently. For years, I had adapted to perception. I had managed dynamics. I had allowed narrative to shape my space. That night, I stepped outside the narrative entirely. Silence had served as protection. Now it was becoming a strategy. And I understood something with clarity I hadn't felt before. You don't need to challenge someone's authority loudly to change the power structure. You only need to engage the structure they overlooked. The morning after I forwarded the email to legal, nothing exploded. There was no immediate response, no urgent meeting request, no visible ripple across the office, which told me something important. Escalations that operate through formal channels don't create spectacle. They create a process. Daniel messaged me around 10:15, quick chat. 2 words, casual, neutral. I walked into his office with the same expression I carried into every meeting, composed, attentive, unhurried. He leaned back in his chair. I saw you looped in legal on the contract thread, he said lightly. That felt unnecessary. Unnecessary? I followed escalation protocol. I replied, given the regulatory clauses involved. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. We could have handled that internally. That sentence carried an implication: loyalty, hierarchy, control. I didn't argue. The protocol exists to ensure we don't handle certain exposures internally, I said evenly. It protects the firm. There was a brief pause. Not hostile, just recalibrating. He nodded once. Next time, let's align before escalating. Alignment. I recognized the subtext alignment meant preserving his discretion. I'll continue following documented thresholds, I said, calm, non-negotiable. The conversation ended without raised voices. But something subtle had shifted in the room. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his expression. Not anger, assessment. Over the next week, his tone changed slightly. Emails became more formal. Requests were more carefully worded. Phrases like "as agreed" began appearing where they hadn't before. He was adjusting. Silence, up until that point, had been interpreted as compliance. Now it was being understood as controlled restraint. And I realized something quietly powerful. When you speak rarely, your words carry disproportionate weight. I didn't increase my visibility. I didn't start asserting dominance in meetings. In fact, I became even more measured. I sent follow-up summaries after every key discussion. I requested written confirmation for decision pivots. I documented timeline shifts and ownership allocations. All politely, all professionally. To observers, nothing dramatic was happening. To Daniel, something was... He began double-checking his phrasing. He hesitated before dismissing risk concerns. He included legal in threads earlier than before. Silence had become strategic pressure. There's a misconception that power requires volume. In reality, controlled quiet can create more tension than an argument. Because argument reveals emotion, documentation reveals confidence. I noticed another shift too. Colleagues started copying me directly on strategic threads again. Not because I demanded it, because they sensed structural alignment moving. Authority follows process, and process leaves a record. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel on a call in the conference room. Yes, we're being extra cautious lately, he said, just tightening compliance posture. He didn't mention my name. He didn't need to. Caution had transformed from my personal trait into a firm-wide adjustment. The narrative was adapting, but here's what mattered most. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing when to speak, choosing when to escalate, choosing what to record. Silence was no longer self-protection. It was positioning, and the more controlled I became, the more carefully he moved. Because intimidation requires imbalance, and the imbalance disappears when everything is written down. The most effective preparation is invisible. After the escalation to legal, I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't suddenly become assertive in meetings or reposition myself publicly. If anything, I appeared more contained than before. What they didn't notice was the architecture forming underneath. I began auditing my own footprint inside the firm. Every major client I had stabilized, every risk model I had designed, every compliance intervention that has prevented loss. Not emotionally, structurally. I built a private timeline dates, deliverables, outcomes, and financial implications. I attached supporting documents, email threads, policy references, executive summaries. It wasn't a dossier against Daniel. It was a record of authorship. Because if narrative authority had been shifting away from me, I needed documented clarity on where my strategic contribution began and ended. At the same time, I reviewed my employment contract. Clauses around retaliation, clauses around professional reputation, clauses around restrictive covenants and industry communication. Most people skim those sections when they sign them. I read them like policy architecture. There was a line that stood out. Any communication that materially damages an employee's professional standing without documented cause may constitute formal misconduct. Documented cause. The phrase stayed with me. Over the next month, I observed Daniel more carefully than he observed me. When he delegated, I requested written confirmation of the scope. When he reframed contributions in meetings, I followed up with structured recaps that clarified ownership not aggressively, but precisely. Per today's discussion, I'll finalize the forecasting architecture we discussed and circulate the compliance overlay for executive review. Architecture. Overlay. Language matters. I also began strengthening quiet alliances. Not political alliances, informational ones. I scheduled a coffee with the head of risk governance under the pretext of aligning future expansion models. I shared insights about regulatory tightening trends. No complaints. Insights. I reconnected with a former colleague now working at a partner firm, discussing cross-industry compliance standards. Casual, but strategic. Preparation isn't confrontation. It's optionality. And optionality reduces fear. What they never noticed was that my calm had deepened because my dependence had lessened. I updated my CV, I mapped external opportunities, I calculated savings projections. Not because I planned to leave impulsively, but because leverage only exists when staying is a choice. Then, one afternoon, something happened that clarified everything. During a strategy call with external stakeholders, Daniel confidently outlined a compliance buffer that mirrored language from a framework I had privately drafted weeks earlier. A framework he had initially dismissed as excessive. He spoke fluidly, claiming foresight. No one questioned it. After the call, he sent me a brief message. Good work on the background modeling. Let's keep future drafts tighter. Background modeling? The phrase landed differently this time. Not as erosion, as evidence. I archived the message because patterns had matured into positioning. And positioning, when threatened, often reveals its edge. What they didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, was that I had begun documenting not just risk exposure, but behavioral shifts, tone changes after escalations, reassignment patterns following pushback, language framing in performance commentary, not paranoia, trend analysis. Power imbalances rarely announce themselves through one explosive act. They reveal themselves through accumulated micro-adjustments. And if intimidation ever moved from subtle to explicit, I would have a timeline. I wasn't preparing to attack. I was preparing to withstand. Because once someone realizes their narrative control is weakening, they often attempt to reassert it. Sometimes gently, sometimes carelessly. And carelessness, when written down, becomes something else entirely. The reveal wasn't loud. It didn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a catastrophic mistake. It arrived in the form of a single sentence written casually, confidently, and without the awareness that it would change everything. It was late autumn, performance calibration season. Tension moves differently during that period. Conversations become layered, feedback is filtered, managers become careful about optics, but sometimes careless about tone. Daniel asked me to step into his office near the end of the day. The door closed softly behind me. He didn't sit this time. He remained standing near his desk, arms loosely folded, casual authority. "We need to talk about trajectory," he began. Trajectory. He spoke in measured phrases, said I was valued, said my operational reliability was strong, said leadership requires alignment. Then he leaned slightly forward. "But I'll be candid," he added. Escalating matters externally without aligning internally can create perception issues. Perception issues. I didn't interrupt. He continued. At this level, reputation matters. If people begin to see you as difficult or procedural to the point of obstruction, that can limit mobility. And this industry is smaller than it seems. There it was. Not shouted, not explicit, but clear. Mobility, industry, perception, a soft outline of consequence. I felt no surge of adrenaline, no anger, only clarity. Are you suggesting escalation could impact my standing externally? I asked evenly. He paused just slightly too long. I'm suggesting relationships matter, he replied, and people talk. People talk. In another version of my life, earlier in my career, that sentence would have landed like a threat. It would have triggered defense, anxiety, and urgency to repair. Instead, I felt something different. Relief, because ambiguity had dissolved. Up until that moment, every shift had been deniable. Every repositioning is subtle. Now, the implication was documented if I chose to document it. I nodded calmly. I appreciate the transparency. I said, to ensure clarity, would you be comfortable summarizing that feedback in writing? I want to make sure I reflect accurately. It was a simple request. His expression changed not dramatically, but perceptibly. That's not necessary, he said quickly. This is just developmental guidance. Developmental guidance. Of course, I replied. Then I'll summarize my understanding in a follow-up email for alignment. There was no argument, no raised voices. I left his office and returned to my desk. I didn't write emotionally. I wrote precisely. I summarized the conversation using neutral phrasing, noted discussion on escalation protocol usage, referenced comments regarding industry perception, requested confirmation if any formal concerns regarding professional conduct existed. I ended with a sentence that mattered. Please let me know if I have misunderstood any aspect of the feedback. Then I sent it. His reply came an hour later. Brief. Your summary reflects our discussion. Let's ensure alignment moving forward. That was it. 2 sentences. But those sentences contained implication, escalation, perception, industry mobility, and confirmation. That was the private reveal. The leverage wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was structural. If intimidation remained subtle, it lived in tone and suggestion. If intimidation was documented, it lived in the record. And record moves differently inside organizations. I didn't forward the exchange immediately. I didn't react impulsively. I simply archived it in a folder labeled Performance Calibration Q4. No celebration, no sense of victory, only certainty. Because intimidation doesn't function in documentation. It requires shadow, and the shadow disappears the moment light is applied in writing. For the first time, I understood completely. If he ever escalated beyond suggestion, if the outline of blacklisting ever became explicit, I wouldn't need to argue. I would only need to forward. The explicit moment came 3 weeks later. Not in person, not in a meeting, in writing. It was a Friday evening, the kind where offices empty early and people become slightly less guarded in tone. We had disagreed earlier that day about a compliance hold I placed on a client deliverable. The issue was legitimate. The contract language required revision before release. Daniel had been irritated, but contained. At 6:42 p.m. an email arrived. Subject line, re-final approval, urgent. The body was short. Olwyn, this continued obstruction is becoming problematic if you insist on escalating routine matters and creating unnecessary friction. I'll have no choice but to reconsider your long-term fit here. The industry is relationship-driven, and I'd be cautious about developing a reputation for being difficult. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. I read it once. Then again. There it was clearer than before. Reconsider your long-term fit. Industry is relationship-driven. Be cautious about reputation. It wasn't phrased as I will blacklist you. It didn't need to be. The implication was unmistakable. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the weight of it, not fear, but gravity. Because this was the line. Up until now, everything had lived in subtext. Now it lived in text. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened my escalation folder and reviewed the timeline. March budget reframing. Compliance dismissal email. Escalation to legal. Performance calibration conversation. Confirmed summary reply. And now this. Patterns matter more than isolated sentences. I had options. Option 1, reply defensively, argue the interpretation, attempt to smooth the tone. Option 2, request clarification again, force him to soften the phrasing. Option 3, do nothing and hope the pressure dissipates. Option 4, treat the email as what it functionally was, a written attempt to deter lawful escalation through implied reputational consequence. Irreversible options require clarity. I opened the firm's code of conduct. There it was, again in unambiguous language. No employee shall be subjected to adverse treatment, explicit or implied, for raising compliance concerns through approved channels. Explicit or implied. My hands were steady. The decision wasn't emotional. It was structural. If I replied directly, the exchange would remain between us, narrative versus narrative. If I forwarded it to legal and HR under formal complaint protocol, it would become institutional. And institutional processes cannot be negotiated through tone. I drafted a new email, not to Daniel. To Legal and Human Resources, subject line formal concern, potential retaliation, following compliance escalation. I attached the full thread. In the body, I provided context, chronologically dates, prior escalations, confirmed summaries, policy references. I did not interpret his intent. I quoted his words. Then I ended with a single sentence. Given the timing and phrasing of the attached correspondence, I am requesting formal review to determine whether this communication aligns with firm policy regarding protected compliance escalation. No adjectives, no emotion, no accusation, just documentation. Before sending, I paused not from doubt but from understanding. Once sent, this would move beyond interpersonal repair. It would enter the process, investigation, record. There would be no quiet retraction, no private apology that erased the implication. This was the irreversible path. I pressed send. Then I shut down my computer and left the office. On the train home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. Because intimidation doesn't dissolve through confrontation. It dissolves through documentation. The week after I sent the formal complaint felt ordinary. That's the unsettling part about institutional processes. They don't announce themselves with alarms. They move through calendar invites and quiet emails labeled confidential. On Monday morning, I received a meeting request from HR and legal. Subject line review, discussion, protected escalation context. No urgency markers, no dramatic phrasing. I accepted. I did not inform Daniel. That was intentional. When you initiate a formal review under the retaliation policy, discretion protects integrity, not secrecy structure. The meeting was virtual. 2 faces on screen, head of HR compliance and senior counsel, both measured, both neutral. They asked for a chronology, not emotion. When did the initial escalation occur? What language had been used previously? Had there been changes in performance commentary following escalation? I answered with dates, not feelings. I referenced archived emails. I cited policy clauses. I provided screenshots of the document version history when asked. There was no rush in the conversation, no leading questions, just a quiet, methodical gathering. At one point, legal asked, "How did you interpret the phrase, reconsider long-term fit, in the context of compliance escalation?" I paused deliberately. I interpreted it as a potential linkage between protected escalation activity and implied career consequence. I replied, which is why I'm requesting formal review rather than assuming intent. Intent is emotional, impact is procedural. They nodded. The meeting ended with a simple statement. We will conduct a confidential review. Please refrain from discussing this matter with involved parties until notified. I returned to work. In meetings, I remained steady. I continued documenting as usual. I didn't change tone. I didn't withdraw effort. If anything, I became even more consistent. That consistency matters. If you escalate and then disengage, it appears reactionary. If you escalate and maintain performance, it reinforces credibility. Daniel's behavior shifted subtly. He became more formal in meetings, more cautious in phrasing. He CC'd HR on a process clarification once almost performative transparency. He did not mention the email. He did not confront me, but I noticed something new: hesitancy. Before redirecting the discussion away from compliance concerns, he paused longer than before. When I cited policy, he didn't dismiss it. He asked for confirmation. Institutional gravity had entered the room. and gravity changes posture. What most people misunderstand about strategic escalation is this: the power doesn't lie in public exposure, it lies in quiet review. There were no rumors circulating, no whispered speculation. Colleagues continued their routines, but systems were moving behind the scenes. Midweek, I received a follow-up from legal requesting additional documentation related to prior calibration commentary. I provided it within the hour. Preparation reduces stress. Because when the request comes, you're not scrambling, you're compiling. I didn't speculate about the outcome. I didn't strategize hypotheticals. I trusted the process. And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Security? Not because I was untouchable, but because the structure I had relied on, policy, documentation, institutional accountability, was now actively engaged. Daniel had operated through implication. I had responded through the record. And the record doesn't argue. It waits. Consequences rarely arrive with an announcement. They appear as adjustments. 2 weeks after the formal review began, Daniel's calendar shifted. Several recurring leadership syncs were reassigned to the director above him. A quarterly strategy presentation he usually led was now co-hosted with risk governance. No one explained why. No one needed to. In meetings, the dynamic felt different, not tense, just recalibrated. Where Daniel once spoke, uninterrupted. Questions now followed his assertions more closely. Legal representatives appeared more frequently on calls involving compliance-sensitive accounts. Language became more precise across the board. I wasn't singled out. I wasn't elevated publicly. The structure simply tightened. One afternoon, during a portfolio review, Daniel began summarizing a client approval as already cleared. I gently interjected. Legal is finalizing written confirmation this afternoon. He paused and instead of reframing, he nodded. Right. Pending formal confirmation. It was subtle, but for someone who had once dismissed escalation as unnecessary, the shift was measurable. A few colleagues began approaching me differently. Not warmer, not distant, more respectful in a structural way. Can you confirm the threshold on this? Should we document that discussion formally? They were asking for guardrails now. Guardrails that had previously been treated as optional. I didn't claim ownership of the shift. I didn't imply anything was happening behind the scenes. I simply responded with clarity. Then, 3 weeks into the review, I received a short message from HR. Thank you for your cooperation. The matter is being addressed internally. You will not experience adverse action related to your escalation. Please notify us immediately if any concerns arise. It was carefully worded, but the phrase that mattered was this: you will not experience adverse action, which meant something had been substantiated enough to require formal protection. Daniel didn't acknowledge the review, but he stopped referencing reputation. He stopped implying mobility risk. He stopped framing compliance as obstruction. Instead, he began using a different language. Let's ensure we're aligned with policy. Document that for clarity. Better to have it reviewed. The irony was quiet. The very behaviors once positioned as excessive were now modeled. Authority had not been removed from him, but it had been observed. An observation changes behavior. I noticed something else, too. He became more cautious in one-on-one conversations, less casual, less suggestive. No more offhand remarks about industry reputation. No more veiled references to trajectory. When power realizes it is being recorded, it softens, not out of humility, out of awareness. The most striking consequence, though, wasn't his adjustment. It was mine. For the first time, I felt entirely unpressured. Not because conflict had vanished, but because clarity had replaced ambiguity. Ambiguity breeds anxiety. Documentation dissolves it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Because I hadn't attacked his position. I had protected mine. And protection, when executed calmly and structurally, doesn't create chaos. It creates boundaries. And boundaries, once established institutionally, are difficult to erase. The attempt to repair it came quietly. About a month after the review began, Daniel asked if we could reset. The phrasing was careful, neutral. We met in a small conference room instead of his office this time. Neutral territory. He spoke first. I think things escalated further than they needed to, he said. There may have been misunderstandings in tone. Misunderstandings? It's a useful word. It implies symmetry. Two parties are misreading each other equally. I listened without interruption. I value your contribution, he continued. And I wouldn't want you to feel unsupported. Feel? The shift in language was noticeable. Previously, the conversation had centered on perception and trajectory. Now it is centered on feeling and value. I appreciate that. I replied, calm, even. He paused. If anything I said came across as limiting your mobility, that wasn't the intention. There it was. Carefully phrased, not an admission, not a denial. I didn't reference the investigation. I didn't mention HR. That wasn't necessary. Thank you for clarifying. I said, for my part, I'll continue following documented protocols to protect the firm. Protect the firm? Not protect myself? He nodded. The meeting ended without tension, without hostility. But here's the truth: once something enters a formal record, it cannot be undone through tone. Institutional memory is different from personal memory. Even if the review concluded with coaching rather than a sanction, the event existed, the email existed, the confirmation existed, and so did the protection notice. After that meeting, Daniel's behavior remained measured, but it was no longer casual. The ease with which he once implied influence beyond the company had disappeared, because that implication had been seen. Once visibility exists, it cannot be reversed. A week later, I received confirmation that my performance calibration would be reviewed independently to ensure neutrality. That had never happened before. Too late to fix it. Not because he had been destroyed or exposed, but because the dynamic had fundamentally changed. He could no longer rely on ambiguity. He could no longer rely on my silence being interpreted as compliance. He had attempted to recalibrate through conversation, but structural recalibration doesn't respond to conversational tone. It responds to policy. I noticed something subtle during our next leadership meeting. When discussing risk thresholds, he deferred to me directly. Olwyn, what does policy require here? Not what do you think? What does policy require? Authority had shifted from personality to framework. And frameworks are impersonal. That's the quiet consequence of documentation. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't expose. It simply narrows available behavior. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't publicly reprimanded. But the informal influence he once exercised through implication had been contained. And containment, once established, is durable. There is no emotional climax in that. Just finality, because once intimidation is documented, it loses oxygen. And without oxygen, it cannot expand. The final confrontation didn't look like a confrontation. It happened during year-end planning, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. The kind of room designed to symbolize transparency. Daniel, the director above him, HR and I were present. No raised voices, no accusation. Just review. The director opened the meeting. We're here to align on role clarity and escalation pathways moving forward. Neutral, procedural. Daniel outlined the team's performance metrics first. Polished, controlled. Then the director turned to me. Olwyn, from your perspective, are current escalation protocols functioning appropriately? It wasn't a trap. It was an invitation. Yes, I said. When documented thresholds are followed, they provide clarity and protection for all parties. For all parties? I didn't frame myself as the injured party. I framed the system as stabilizing. HR interjected gently. We've clarified that no employee should feel career consequences for raising compliance concerns. That's been communicated. Communicated? The language was careful. Daniel nodded. Agreed, he said. There was never intent to imply otherwise. Intent again? I met his gaze calmly. I understand. I replied, which is why documentation is helpful. It prevents misinterpretation. Silence settled briefly in the room, not tense, just weighty, because everyone understood what had occurred without it being relitigated. The director summarized the next steps. Clear written confirmation before strategic pivots. Direct legal inclusion for threshold-level risks. Independent review of forecasting ownership and expansion initiatives. Ownership! That was new. Not handed to me ceremonially, simply acknowledged as fact. The meeting ended without emotion. No apology. No victory. As we stood to leave, Daniel paused near the door. I hope we can move forward productively, he said quietly. We already are, I answered. And I meant it. Confrontation without heat is disarming because it removes the narrative of conflict. There was no dramatic arc, no fallen villain, no triumphant speech. Just recalibration. When intimidation is met with anger, it escalates. When intimidation is met with documentation, it contracts. Daniel wasn't disgraced. He was adjusted, and I wasn't vindicated. I was clarified. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't about overpowering someone publicly. It's about ensuring that structures function as written, especially when someone assumes they can operate outside them. After that meeting, I returned to my desk and opened my notebook. I didn't write about him. I wrote about myself. You do not need to raise your voice to establish a boundary, because boundaries anchored in policy are stronger than boundaries anchored in emotion. And once a boundary is institutional, it doesn't require repetition. It simply exists. I didn't leave the firm. That surprises people when I tell this story privately. There's an assumption that empowerment must end in departure, that the arc of dignity requires a dramatic exit, a resignation letter, a new title elsewhere. But sometimes power stays. Staying not because you're afraid to move, staying because you no longer need to. The months following the review were quieter than the months before it, not because tension disappeared, but because clarity replaced ambiguity. My role shifted formally this time. Forecasting ownership was reassigned to me in writing. Compliance review processes were updated with my name listed as the primary signatory before executive release. Not as a favor, as a function. I didn't request the changes. They emerged through a structural audit. That's the difference between arguing for recognition and allowing the record to reveal it. Daniel and I maintained a professional relationship, measured, civil, focused on output. We don't discuss what happened. We don't need to, because once someone understands that implication can become evidence, they recalibrate naturally. I'm not bitter. That's important to say. Bitterness ties you to the person who underestimated you. It keeps you reacting long after the event has passed. I don't feel anger when I think about him. I feel precision. The experience refined me. It clarified my moral code in a way that theory never could. Never escalate emotionally, always escalate structurally. I still carry my black leather notebook. But now it's not just a place to record risk or timelines. It's where I write questions before I answer them. I slow down before responding. Where I remind myself that quiet isn't submission, it's selection. Selection of timing. Selection of language. Selection of structure. I used to believe my calm was something others tolerated. Now I understand it's something they must adapt to. Because calm paired with documentation is difficult to destabilize. There's a different kind of confidence that comes from knowing you don't need approval to protect yourself. You don't need agreement to follow the policy. You don't need permission to create a record. Who I am now isn't louder. It's clearer. I no longer accept roles assigned through convenience. If someone positions me as supportive infrastructure, I clarify authorship in writing. If someone implies consequences for compliance, I escalate through the process. Not as retaliation, as alignment. The industry is still relationship-driven, but relationships built on implied silence are fragile. Relationships built on documented clarity are sustainable. I am still dependable, still steady, but no longer invisible in authorship. And that shift didn't require confrontation. It required confidence in structure. When people hear the title, "My manager threatened to blacklist me, I forwarded the threat to legal," they expect something explosive. They expect humiliation, exposure, a dramatic collapse of authority. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter. A sentence was written. A policy was referenced. A structure was engaged. And intimidation lost its oxygen. The most important lesson I learned through this wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't about corporate politics or hierarchy. It was about fear. Intimidation only works when you believe a consequence can be imposed without a record. It works when you assume reputation is controlled by whoever speaks loudest. It works when you accept implication as reality instead of asking for clarity in writing. The moment something is documented, power shifts, not because you become aggressive, but because you become precise. Documentation removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where manipulation thrives. I didn't destroy someone's career. I didn't win. I aligned behavior with policy. That's all. And alignment, when done calmly, often feels anticlimactic. But it's durable. If you're in a situation where someone is hinting at consequences for doing the right thing, especially in matters of compliance, ethics, or integrity, remember this. You don't need to argue your character. You don't need to prove your loyalty. You don't need to outspeak them. You need to document. You need to reference the structure. You need to let institutions do what they are designed to do. Intimidation doesn't work when it's documented. That's the truth. And I'm curious, Have you ever experienced a moment where writing something down changed the balance of power in your life? I'd really like to hear your story.